The morning dew clung to the Kentucky bluegrass as Harrison Wells strode across his sprawling horse farm, his Italian leather boots leaving dark impressions in the pristine lawn. The rising sun cast long shadows behind the white-painted fences that stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to the empire he'd built from nothing but grit and an unwavering determination to be the best in the thoroughbred business. His prize mare, Star's Promise, was in labor. The gentle nickering from the spotless foaling barn drew him forward, though his face remained impassive. This wasn't sentiment, it was business. Star's Promise had won him the Kentucky Derby 2 years ago, and her first foal could be worth millions if it inherited her speed and spirit. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of fresh hay and anticipation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, his head veterinarian, knelt beside the laboring mare, her experienced hands guiding the process. The other stable hands stood at a respectful distance, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Harrison checked his Rolex, 5:47 a.m. The sun was barely cresting the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. "Almost there," Dr. Martinez murmured, her voice steady despite the hours she'd spent monitoring the birth. Star's Promise let out a low, pained whinny, and Harrison's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the stall door. This wasn't just any foal. This was the culmination of years of careful breeding, the potential cornerstone of his next racing dynasty. The birth happened quickly after that. One moment Star's Promise was straining, her coat dark with sweat, and the next, a wet bundle of spindly legs and possibility lay in the fresh straw. Dr. Martinez moved with practiced efficiency, clearing the foal's airways and checking its vital signs while the mother nickered softly to her newborn. "It's a colt," Dr. Martinez announced, her voice carrying a note of triumph. Harrison allowed himself a small smile. A male offspring from his champion mare. The possibilities were endless. He could already see the headlines. Imagine the bidding wars that would erupt when this colt reached selling age. But something was wrong. The foal's movements were jerky, uncertain in a way that spoke of more than just newborn awkwardness. Dr. Martinez's expression shifted, her professional mask slipping as she shone a small light into the colt's eyes. Harrison felt the temperature in the barn drop 10 degrees before she even opened her mouth. "Mr. Wells," she began, her voice careful, measured. "The colt, he's blind. Both eyes are completely non-responsive to light." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the morning birds seemed to hold their breath. Harrison's face hardened into granite, his earlier smile forgotten like yesterday's racing forms. "Blind," he repeated, the word falling from his lips like a death sentence. "There are treatments we could explore," Dr. Martinez started, but Harrison cut her off with a sharp gesture. "A blind horse is worthless to me," he said, his voice as cold as a December morning. "Handle it." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the barn, leaving behind a wake of uncomfortable silence and unspoken protests. Joey Parker, the youngest stable hand, felt his stomach turn as he realized what "handle it" meant. At 19, he'd only been working at Wells Racing Stables for 8 months, but he knew Mr. Wells's reputation for ruthless efficiency. A blind foal would never race, never bring in prize money or breeding fees. In Harrison Wells's world, that made it nothing but a liability. The day passed in a blur of whispered conversations and averted eyes. No one wanted to be the one to carry out Mr. Wells's implied order, but everyone knew someone had to. As the sun began to set, painting the Kentucky hills in watercolor shades of purple and gold, Joey found himself leading the wobbly-legged colt into the back of a small trailer. The mother's distressed whinnies followed them down the long driveway, each cry like a knife in Joey's chest. He told himself he was doing this to save the colt from a worse fate, but the weight of what he was about to do sat like lead in his stomach. Miles away from the pristine fences and manicured lawns of Wells Racing Stables, Joey pulled onto a narrow dirt road that led into Daniel Boone National Forest. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches reaching across the path like grasping fingers in the growing darkness. The colt stumbled as Joey led him from the trailer, his unseeing eyes wide with fear at the unfamiliar sounds and smells of the forest. "I'm sorry," Joey whispered, his voice thick. He'd brought a blanket, some hay, In a bucket of water, a pitiful attempt at easing his conscience, the colt pressed against him, seeking warmth and reassurance, and Joey had to force himself to step away. "I'm so sorry." The drive back to the stables was the longest of Joey's life. In his rearview mirror, he could see the small form of the colt growing smaller and smaller, until the darkness swallowed it completely. The sound of crickets and night birds filled the forest, nature's symphony masking the soft, frightened nickering of an abandoned newborn. But fate had other plans for the blind colt that night. Just over the ridge, in a modest farmhouse set back from the main road, 12-year-old Tommy Anderson lay awake in his bed, unable to sleep. The summer air was thick with humidity, and even with his window open, the breeze did little to cool his small room. Tommy lived with his Aunt Sarah since his parents' accident 2 years ago. The transition from suburban Cincinnati to rural Kentucky had been tough, but he'd found solace in the quiet beauty of the forest and the simple rhythm of farm life. Their small property bordered the national forest, and Tommy often spent hours exploring the woods, much to his aunt's mixed amusement and concern. A sound caught his attention, different from the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and owls. It was a high-pitched, plaintive cry that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Tommy sat up in bed, pressing his face against the window screen. There it was again, a sound of distress that seemed to call directly to his heart. Without thinking twice, Tommy grabbed his flashlight from the bedside table and pulled on his boots. He knew Aunt Sarah would be furious if she caught him sneaking out after dark, but something in that cry told him this couldn't wait until morning. Careful to skip the creaky third step, he made his way downstairs and out the back door. The night air wrapped around him like a warm blanket as he followed the sound into the forest. His flashlight beam bounced off tree trunks and understory, creating shifting shadows that would have frightened him in other circumstances. But tonight, Tommy was focused entirely on finding the source of those heartrending cries. He found the colt in a small clearing, huddled against the base of a massive oak tree. The blanket Joey had left was tangled around its legs, and the water bucket had already been knocked over. As Tommy's flashlight beam swept across the clearing, the colt raised its head, ears swiveling toward the sound of Tommy's approaching footsteps. "Hey there," Tommy called softly, keeping his voice low and gentle. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The colt's unseeing eyes were wide with fear, but something in Tommy's voice seemed to calm it. As he drew closer, Tommy could see how young the foal was. It couldn't have been more than a day old. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone had abandoned this newborn foal in the forest, leaving it to die. Anger flared in his chest, hot and fierce, but he pushed it aside. Right now, the colt needed help, not anger. Slowly, carefully, Tommy approached the trembling animal. He kept talking in that same soft, steady voice, letting the colt become accustomed to his presence. When he was close enough to touch, he reached out and gently stroked the colt's neck. The foal flinched at first, but then pressed into his touch, seeking comfort. "You can't see, can you?" Tommy whispered as he noticed the colt's unfocused eyes. "Is that why they left you out here?" The thought made his throat tight with emotion. He knew what it was like to be left alone, to have your whole world turned upside down in an instant. Making his decision, Tommy carefully untangled the blanket from the colt's legs. "Come on," he said, wrapping it properly around the shivering animal. "You're coming home with me." The colt seemed to understand, following Tommy's gentle tugs on the blanket with cautious steps. The journey back to the farmhouse was slow. Tommy had to guide the colt around every obstacle, talking constantly to help it navigate by sound. By the time they reached the old barn behind the house, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The barn wasn't much, nothing like the state-of-the-art facilities at Wells Racing Stables, but it was dry and safe. Tommy made a bed of fresh hay in one of the empty stalls, his mind already racing with plans. He knew keeping a horse would be expensive, knew Aunt Sarah might say they couldn't afford it, but looking at the colt's trusting face, he knew he had to try. "You need a name," he said, stroking the colt's soft nose. The first rays of morning sun were streaming through the barn's dusty windows, catching in the colt's pale coat and making it shimmer. Despite its blindness, there was something luminous about the animal, something that seemed to glow from within. Light, Tommy decided. I'm going to call you Light. The colt nickered softly, as if in approval, and Tommy felt something warm bloom in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but this moment marked the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one that would change not only his life but the lives of everyone around him. As the sun rose fully over the Kentucky hills, Tommy sat in the straw beside Light, his hand resting on the colt's neck. He could hear Aunt Sarah moving around in the kitchen, knew he'd have to face her soon and explain everything. But for now, he simply sat with his new friend, watching the dust motes dance in the morning light and feeling, for the first time since losing his parents, that maybe everything would be okay. The world outside the barn was waking up. Birds called their morning songs, and a warm breeze carried the scent of summer through the open barn door. Light's ears swiveled, taking in each new sound, and Tommy realized that while the colt might not be able to see the world, he could experience it in other ways. Maybe, Tommy thought, they could learn those ways together. Chapter 2, The Rescue. The smell of coffee and bacon woke Tommy from his light doze. He hadn't realized he'd fallen asleep in the barn, his back pressed against the rough wooden wall of Light's makeshift stall. The colt was still sleeping, his chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of dreams. Morning sunlight streamed through the gaps in the weathered boards, creating patterns on the straw-covered floor. Tommy's muscles protested as he stood, stiff from sleeping in such an awkward position. He knew he couldn't put off facing Aunt Sarah any longer. The screen door creaked as he entered the kitchen, and there she was, standing at the stove with her back to him. Her dark hair was pulled back in its usual practical ponytail, and she was humming softly as she flipped pancakes. "Thomas James Anderson," she said without turning around, "would you like to explain why your boots are caked with mud and why you weren't in your bed this morning?" Tommy took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Aunt Sarah, I need to show you something, but first, I need you to promise to listen to the whole story before you say no." Now she did turn, spatula in hand, one eyebrow raised. "That's not the most reassuring way to start a conversation, young man. Please." Tommy met her eyes, trying to convey all the importance of this moment. "It's about doing the right thing." Sarah Anderson had raised her sister's son for 2 years now. Ever since the accident that took both his parents, she'd watched him struggle with grief, with anger, with the profound loneliness that comes from having your world shattered. But she'd also seen his inherent kindness, his determination to help others even when he was hurting himself. Something in his expression now reminded her of his mother. "All right," she sighed, turning off the stove. "Show me." The walk to the barn seemed both too long and too short. Tommy's heart was pounding as he pushed open the door, letting the morning light spill across the threshold. Light had woken up and was standing in his stall, ears pricked forward at the sound of their approach. "Oh, Tommy," Sarah breathed, taking in the sight of the newborn colt. "Where did you?" Tommy told her everything, about hearing the cries in the night, about finding Light abandoned in the forest, about his blindness. As he spoke, Light moved toward the sound of his voice, nickering softly. Without seeming to realize it, Sarah reached out to stroke the colt's velvet nose. "We can't afford a horse," she said finally, but her voice was gentle. "You know that, honey. The farm barely breaks even as it is." "I'll work harder," Tommy promised immediately. "I'll do extra chores, get a job in town. Mr. Peterson at the feed store said he could use help on weekends, and Light can stay in the old barn. We don't need fancy stables or anything." Sarah looked at her nephew's earnest face, then back at the blind colt who had somehow found his way to them in the darkness. She thought about second chances and about how sometimes love means taking risks that logic says you shouldn't. "We'll need to have a vet check him out," she said slowly. "And you'll need to learn everything you can about caring for horses, especially one with special needs." Tommy's face lit up with hope. "Does that mean?" "It means we'll try," Sarah said firmly. "But Tommy, you have to understand. This is a huge responsibility. If we do this, Light will be completely dependent on you. It won't be easy." "I know," Tommy said, reaching out to stroke Light's neck. "But he needs us," and Sarah. "And maybe we need him too." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Dr. Emily Chen, the local veterinarian, confirmed Light's complete blindness but declared him otherwise healthy. She showed Tommy how to bottle feed the orphan colt, explaining that without his mother's milk, Light would need special nutrition to thrive. His other senses will compensate for his lack of sight, Dr. Chin explained as she watched Tommy carefully feed Light. Horses naturally have excellent hearing and sense of smell. With proper training, he can learn to navigate quite well. Tommy threw himself into learning everything he could about horses. He borrowed books from the library, watched countless videos online, and peppered Dr. Chen with questions whenever she visited. Sarah watched with a mixture of pride and concern as her nephew's dedication never wavered. Even when things got difficult, and things did get difficult, Light was completely dependent on them, requiring feeding every few hours, day and night. Tommy set alarms on his phone, trudging out to the barn in all weather to ensure the colt got his nutrition. There were moments of frustration too, as Light bumped into things or became frightened by unexpected noises. But there were also moments of pure joy. The first time Light recognized Tommy's footsteps and nickered and greeted. The day the colt finally figured out how to find his water bucket by sound. The morning Tommy came out to find Light had managed to navigate his entire stall without bumping into a single wall. Word spread through their small community about the blind colt and the boy who had rescued him. Not all the reactions were positive. Some neighbors thought Sarah was foolish for letting Tommy take on such a responsibility. Others predicted the colt wouldn't survive, that nature had intended to take its course that night in the forest. Tommy learned to ignore the whispers and sideways glances. He focused instead on Light's progress, on the growing bond between them. He discovered that Light could follow the sound of his voice with uncanny accuracy. So he started talking constantly when they were together, describing everything around them. "The sun's setting now," he would say as they stood in the paddock they'd fenced off behind the barn. "It's turning the sky all orange and pink, like someone spilled watercolors across it. There's a cool breeze coming from the west. Can you feel it? It's making the tall grass dance like waves on a golden sea." Light's ears would swivel toward Tommy's voice, following his descriptions with keen interest. The colt had developed an extraordinary ability to create mental maps of his surroundings through sound, smell, and touch. Tommy noticed how Light would pause before each step, testing the ground with his hoof, learning the texture of different surfaces. The packed earth of the barn aisle felt different from the springy grass of the paddock, and Light learned to use these subtle variations to orient himself. During their daily walks, Tommy developed a system of verbal cues that Light seemed to understand instinctively. Step up meant there was a change in elevation ahead, while easy warned of potentially tricky footing. Light learned to trust these signals completely, moving with growing confidence despite his inability to see. Sarah watched their progress from the farmhouse porch, her heart warming at the sight of her nephew and the blind colt working together. She'd seen Tommy withdraw into himself after his parents' death, building walls around his grief. But Light had somehow found a way through those walls, drawing Tommy back into the world one gentle nicker at a time. The summer days stretched long and golden, filled with the rhythm of care and training. Tommy spent hours in the paddock with Light, teaching him to recognize different sounds and their meanings. He created obstacle courses using old barrels and poles, guiding Light through them with his voice alone. The local kids would sometimes gather at the fence to watch, their initial skepticism turning to amazement as Light navigated the challenges with increasing skill. "It's like they can read each other's minds," whispered Jenny Martinez, the veterinarian's daughter, as she watched Tommy lead Light through a particularly complex pattern. The colt moved with a grace that seemed impossible for an animal who couldn't see, responding to the slightest change in Tommy's voice. The bond between boy and horse grew stronger with each passing day. Light would recognize Tommy's footsteps long before he reached the barn, nickering a greeting that never failed to bring a smile to Tommy's face. They developed their own language of touch and sound, a way of communicating that transcended the need for sight. On warm nights, Tommy would sometimes sleep in the barn, his sleeping bag spread out in the sweet-smelling hay beside Light's stall. He'd tell Light stories about his parents, about the life he'd had before moving to Kentucky, about his dreams for the future. The colt would listen, his soft breaths and occasional gentle nickering providing comfort in the darkness they now shared. "You know what, Light?" Tommy whispered one such night, his hand resting on the colt's warm neck. I used to think losing something meant the end of everything. When my parents died, it felt like the world had stopped making sense. But you've never even seen the world, and you still find so much joy in it. You're teaching me how to see things differently. As summer began to fade into fall, Light's progress continued to amaze everyone who saw him. The colt had grown significantly, his frame filling out with proper nutrition and exercise. His coat gleamed like polished silver in the sunlight, and despite his unseeing eyes, there was an intelligence and awareness in his bearing that caught people's attention. Dr. Chian made regular visits, monitoring Light's development with professional interest and personal investment. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she admitted to Sarah one afternoon, watching as Tommy guided Light through a series of increasingly complex maneuvers. The level of trust between them, the way they've adapted to work around his blindness, it's extraordinary. The transformation wasn't just physical. Light's confidence grew with each successful navigation of his world, each new skill mastered. He learned to distinguish between different people's footsteps, different animals' calls, even different types of weather approaching. His other senses had indeed compensated for his lack of sight, developing to an almost supernatural degree. Tommy worked tirelessly to create a consistent routine that would help Light feel secure. Every morning began with grooming, their time together filled with quiet conversation and gentle touches. Light learned to stand perfectly still as Tommy curry-combed his coat, picking up his feet on command for cleaning and checking. These simple acts of care became a meditation for both of them, a daily ritual of trust and connection. The old barn, once just a storage space for Sarah's limited farming equipment, had been transformed into a proper stable for Light. Tommy had spent weeks cleaning it out, repairing loose boards, and creating a safe environment for a blind horse. He learned basic carpentry from YouTube videos and the patient guidance of Mr. Peterson at the feed store, who'd taken an interest in the boy's determination. Each new achievement, no matter how small, was celebrated. The first time Light managed to find his way back to the barn on his own, following the sound of Tommy's voice and his memory of the path, they'd had a small party. Sarah had baked cupcakes, and Jenny had brought special horse treats she'd made herself. Even some of the skeptical neighbors had started to come around, impressed by the dedication they witnessed. As autumn painted the Kentucky hills in brilliant shades of red and gold, Tommy began to dream bigger. He'd been reading about other blind horses, about the possibilities that existed despite their limitations. There were stories of blind horses who competed in shows, who worked with disabled children, who defied every expectation placed upon them. "What do you think, boy?" Tommy asked one evening as they stood in the paddock, the setting sun warming their backs. "Think we could do something like that? Show everyone what you're really capable of?" Light nudged Tommy's shoulder gently, as if in agreement, and Tommy felt that familiar surge of possibility in his chest. The paddock had become their training ground, a space where limitations dissolved and possibilities took root. Tommy had gradually increased the complexity of their obstacle courses, using different textures and sounds to help Light understand what was being asked of him. The colt's natural athleticism, combined with his extraordinary sensory awareness, made him a quick learner. Sarah watched all of this with growing amazement. She'd agreed to keep Light mainly because she couldn't bear to break Tommy's heart, but the colt had proved to be so much more than just a rescue project. He had become a catalyst for healing, not just for Tommy, but for their entire small family. The farm, which had sometimes felt too quiet and empty after Tommy's parents died, now hummed with purpose and life. Each evening, as the sun painted the Kentucky sky in brilliant hues, Tommy and Light would stand together in their paddock, sharing the quiet moment. Though Light couldn't see the spectacular sunsets, Tommy had noticed how the colt seemed to feel the changing light on his coat, how he would turn his face toward the warm fleck of flower seeking the sun. "The clouds are like cotton candy tonight," Tommy would say, continuing their tradition of shared observation, all pink and purple and gold. "There's a flock of geese flying south, their calls echoing across the valley. Can you hear them, Light? They're following their own path, just like us." These quiet moments at dusk became their sacred time, a pause in the day when the world seemed to hold its breath. Light would stand perfectly still, his ears moving like radar dishes, taking in every sound of the gathering evening. The crickets would begin their nightly chorus, a familiar symphony that Light had learned to use as one of his many natural waypoints. As autumn deepened, Tommy noticed how Light had begun to anticipate the changing seasons. The colt's coat grew thicker, preparing for the coming winter, and his sensitivity to weather changes became almost uncanny. He could sense approaching storms hours before the first clouds appeared, becoming restless in his stall and alerting Tommy with soft, anxious nickering. One particularly crisp evening, as they stood in their usual spot, Tommy heard the crunch of leaves behind them. He turned to find Jenny Martinez approaching, her dark hair caught in the last rays of sunlight. She'd become a regular visitor to the farm, sharing Tommy's fascination with Light's progress and often bringing new ideas for training exercises. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, coming to stand beside them. Light's ears swiveled toward her voice, and he gave a soft nicker of recognition. Jenny had earned his trust over the months, her gentle presence and calm energy, making her one of the few people besides Tommy that Light fully accepted. "We were just watching the sunset," Tommy replied, then caught himself with a small laugh. "Well, I'm watching it. Light's listening to it, I guess." Jenny smiled, reaching out to stroke Light's neck. "You know, my mom says she's never seen anything like you two. She's been treating horses for 20 years, but she's never seen a blind horse adapt so well, or a connection quite like this." Tommy felt a warm pride bloom in his chest, but it was tempered by humility. "Light does all the hard work," he said. "I just try to be there for him, to help him understand the world in his own way." As if in response to Tommy's words, Light shifted slightly, pressing his warm shoulder against the boy's side. These small gestures of affection had become more frequent as their bond deepened, each one a reminder of the trust they built together. The evening air grew cooler, carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called out, its haunting cry echoing through the trees. Light's ears pricked forward, tracking the sound with practiced ease. "Tommy," Jenny said suddenly, her voice taking on an excited tone, "have you ever thought about entering Light in the county fair next spring? Not for the regular competitions, obviously, but maybe as a demonstration. People need to see what he can do, what you've accomplished together." The idea caught Tommy by surprise. He dreamed of showing others Light's capabilities, but the thought of doing it in such a public way made his stomach flutter with both excitement and anxiety. He looked at Light, standing calm and confident beside him despite his blindness, and felt something shift in his perspective. "You really think we could do that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenny nodded enthusiastically. "The way you've trained him to navigate obstacles, the trust between you. It's incredible, Tommy. And think about what it could mean for other people facing challenges. Light could inspire so many people." As the last light faded from the sky, the first stars beginning to twinkle overhead, Tommy let himself imagine it. He pictured Light moving through a course with the same grace he showed in their private practice sessions, proving to everyone that limitations were just challenges waiting to be overcome. The crickets grew louder as darkness settled over the paddock, their chirping creating a familiar nighttime rhythm. A cool breeze rustled through the remaining leaves on the trees, carrying the promise of frost. Light shifted his weight, a subtle signal that he was ready for his evening meal in the warmth of his stall. "Come on, boy," Tommy said softly, giving Light's neck a gentle pat. "Let's get you settled for the night. We've got lots to think about." As they made their way back to the barn, Tommy's mind raced with possibilities. Jenny's suggestion had planted a seed, one that was already beginning to take root and grow. Maybe this was the next step in their journey together, a chance to show the world that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in darkness. The barn welcomed them with its familiar smells of hay and leather, the wooden walls holding the day's warmth. Tommy moved through their evening routine with practiced ease, measuring out Light's feed and fresh water, checking his stall for any hazards. These simple tasks had become a meditation of sorts, a daily ritual that grounded them both. Light's soft munching filled the barn as he ate his dinner, the sound mixing with the distant calls of night birds and the whisper of wind through the rafters. Tommy sat on an overturned bucket, watching his friend and letting his mind wander through the possibilities that Jenny's suggestion had opened up. The county fair was months away, But Tommy knew from experience that time had a way of slipping past quickly. If they were going to do this, they would need to start preparing soon. They would need to develop new routines, practice in different environments, get Light accustomed to crowds and unfamiliar noises. But as he watched Light navigate his stall with perfect confidence, turning to Knickers softly in his direction, Tommy felt a surge of certainty. They had already accomplished so much together, defying expectations and proving that trust could overcome any obstacle. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them the same way they had faced everything else together, one step at a time, guided by their unshakable bond.